Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Tickernomics YouTube channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create custom scatter plots using scripting in my website, Tickernomics. So scatter plots are a new functionality that we just recently added to the website. And I think this is a really useful feature because scatter plots allow you to observe relationships between two or even more data points, and it can help you understand some pretty unique insights about a company or an industry or really whatever you're trying to look at. So scatter plots are something I'm really happy that we now have on the website, and I want to show you guys how you can create your own scatter plots because I know everyone has their own, types of analysis they want to do, their own things, their own industries that they're interested in looking at. So this video is really to show you one example of how you can create scatter plots, and then you can use the lessons in this and apply it to whatever you're trying to do. So the example that we're going to use is, again, we're going to stick with the theme of looking at technology companies that are TSX listed. And we're going to create a scatter plot that compares revenue growth over the past 3 years for those technology companies and also the price to sales ratio. So the idea is typically companies that have had higher historical revenue growth will probably have a higher price to sales ratio. So if there's an outlier, for example, a company that has had very high revenue growth, but maybe a relatively lower price to sales ratio, then that could be interesting for us because maybe that signals the company's undervalued and it's an outlier in the industry, and we can it's unique in some way, and we can learn a bit more about it. So to start things off, we'll open my scripts here. So just click my scripts, and we'll open up a new one here, and we'll start by naming it. So I'll do I'll call it TSX Tech Stocks 3 year 3 year average rev growth versus price to sales. So this is kind of a long name, but this is what we'll go with. And then the category will be scatter plots. Again, you don't have to name these or put the category anything specific, but generally you should, name things what they actually are. And this script has to do a few things. So one, we're going to create a for loop that goes through every company that we have on the website, which is about 8,000 different companies. And it's going to screen all of those companies to determine if they are TSX listed and if they're a tech stock. All right, so that's the first thing. And then once it's done that, it's going to calculate the 3 year average revenue growth, right? So one of the metrics, it'll determine what the current price to sales ratio is. And then it's just going to populate 1 point on that scatter plot for each company that meets all of that criteria. And then once we've done that, we really just have to determine, kind of set the boundaries of the scatter plot. So what we want the x-axis to be called, what the y-axis is going to be called, and things like that. So it is pretty simple. The first thing we're going to do here is we're going to use a function called get ticker count. So I used this in my last tutorial. So what get ticker count does is it determines the total number of tickers that we currently have on the website or companies that we have on the website. So I'll rename this. So ticker total equals get ticker count. So we're assigning this variable ticker total to equal, whatever the ticker count is going to be. And then we're going to do a for loop. So like I said, we have to use a for loop for this. And the way for loops work is they iterate through, whatever boundaries or parameters you set. And you set the parameters by using commas. So we want to start from 0 and then go all the way to ticker total. So we're starting from 0. So, the first company that we have on the website, iterate through all the companies, all 8,000 or so companies that we have on here. So the way we start, we can do I equals 0. So we're basically saying the variable I is 0. So we're starting at 0, ticker total. So this is the variable that we just defined, and another comma, and then we have to define what this for loop will increment at, which we want it to increment at 1, because we want to go through every single company, not every second company or every 5 companies, every single company. So it's going to go through that. So for those, and then we do, right? So for that, and then we're going to define local ticker equals get ticker by index. So this is another function, and each company that we have on the website is assigned an index number. So it's something along the lines of Apple is 0, Microsoft is 1, Google is 2. It's something like that, right? So each company has an index, and by assigning, the variable ticker to index, this allows us to basically obtain, the index number for a company as it iterates through that for loop, right? And then we can use this later on in our script where instead of, if we're trying to create a function that calls, a company's exchange, we don't have to write the individual company name. We just write ticker, because then as it goes through that for loop, it's, for whatever ticker it's currently on, as it goes through the for loop, it's going to pull, the index number, and then we'll determine if the exchange is what we want it to be. And then we're going to put an I in here. So we're basically assigning the variable I as the index here, right? And then next is local. We're going to define the exchange. So exchange equals a function called get company prop str. So what this does is it gets the property of a company. So this is another custom function we have in the scripting engine here. And then we'll write ticker. So whatever company it's currently on, as it iterates through this, we want to find the company property. And a company property is, going to be, it's a string property, which means it's text. So it could be the company name, the country they belong to, sector, industry, anything like that. In this case, we want the exchange. So we'll write exchange here. And then we're going to do the same thing, same exact function, except with sector. Because again, we want exchange, we want the TSX, and then sector, we want the technology sector. So I'll just paste that here and then change this to sector. So all this does is it just defines the variable exchange to mean, the exchange for the company. So the next thing we have to do is an if statement. So if, and then in brackets, we do exchange. And then the way in an if function you make it equal to something is you do equals equals. So this basically is saying that the exchange has to be, and then the TSX, the code for the TSX in the system is TO. So the exchange has to be TO, which is the TSX, and in another bracket, the sector has to be technology, right? So if those two conditions are met, it's if, and then. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to have to define the variables that we actually want to calculate. So if you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll probably know how to do this. And this, just for simplicity, I'm going to copy and paste it into the script so I don't waste time typing it out. But basically, we have current revenue, TTM. So this is the current value of the revenue for the trailing 12 months. So it gets the latest value, which is this function get XBRL latest for, whatever ticker that the for loop is currently on. And again, it only does the tickers for the ones that are TSX stocks and technology stocks, and then it gets this metric here. So I'm going to save this for now. And then just for reference, this metric, any metric that you want to use when you're pulling financial data, you can find is if you search up the company, you go to details, all this data here is all different properties that you can use in a script. So if I were to go to, MM revenue one, so you can see right here, MM revenue TTM for Apple is about 387 billion. So you could look at that for any company, right? So then we have that. And then we're going to have to pull revenue from 3 years ago. So the way we do that is local today equals this function called get today day. So this pretty simply just gets whatever day is in the system. Now, this data in the system goes back to around 2011. So say January 1st in 2011 would be day one. And then every additional day, so, we're on May 1st to 2023, that's going to add, one more day to the total, and then another day and another day, and it keeps progressing. So whichever day we're currently on, as you run, on the day when you run this script, this function will retrieve that day. And we're setting it equal to the variable today. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do something that we call define 3 years ago. So this basically is a variable that we can use for our function that calls the financial data, which is we want to call the financial data as of 3 years ago. So it's today minus 3 times 365. So 3 years ago, right? And then I'm going to save this. And then I'm going to copy and paste this next one in just because it's a bit long, but I'll explain what it means. So local revenue 3 years ago equals get XBRL. So this is a function that, gets data for, the ticker that it's currently on, the time period, which you've already defined is 3 years ago. This next argument here, we're going to leave blank because this just refers to segment data, which we don't have on the website yet, but we will in the future. So it's kind of a placeholder for the future. And then the metric that we want, which is revenue for the trailing 12 months. So what this does is it defines this to equal revenue for the trailing 12 months as of 3 years ago. So we have revenue for the trailing 12 months as of today and as of 3 years ago. So then we're going to calculate the compound annual growth rate for those years, which again, I'll copy and paste this in. And it's a function that, this is really just math, but basically it's a function that we go current revenue for the trailing 12 months divided by revenue as of 3 years ago to the power of 1 divided by 3, and then we subtract 1, and this basically determines what the annual growth rate was for revenue. So it could be 20% per year, 10% a year, whatever the case is. And then we multiply it by 100 so that we get a full number. So instead of, say, 0.25, we get 25, which indicates 25%. All right, so we've got revenue CAGR, which is compound annual growth rate, variable defined here. This is going to be one axis on our scatter plot. The other one is going to be price to sales, which this one's a lot simpler. We don't have to get any historical data for that. We just use get XBRL latest, ticker, the 2 commas here, and then MMPS, which is our metric for the price to sales ratio. MM just means main metric, by the way. So it's main metric, PS for the price to sales ratio. All right. So now I'll save that. The next thing we have to do is actually define our scatter plot points. So we've got, the variables that we need for the x-axis and the y-axis. Now we have to actually define our scatter points, which I'll just put a comment in here. So if I do 2 dashes, then anything I write after 2 dashes is going to be ignored by the script reader. So we'll do an if statement here. And we're going to basically add some common sense checks into this. And I'm just going to copy and paste these in just for simplicity here. But basically, we're saying that if we basically want to weed out any, data points that don't really make sense, any data points that are just, extremely large that maybe is a glitch in the system or something like that for some small company that, just happened to end up in the system somehow. We want to weed those out so the data looks a bit cleaner. So basically, if the compound annual growth rate of the revenue is greater than, we have 10,000% here, and the price to sales ratio has to be below 100, which I don't think there's many companies that have a price to sales ratio above 100. We could even make this, 200 if we just wanted to, make it a bit easier. All right. So basically, if those 2 conditions are true, so it's not some weird outlier company, then we're going to do this function. This is the scatter plot function. It's called set generic chart point. And keep in mind that we're including this inside of this for loop. So everything that we're doing here is inside the for loop, right? And when we do set generic chart point, this just sets one chart point. But because the code is within the code of the for loop, then it's going to, populate one data point on the scatter plot as it kind of iterates through every company, determines if it meets the conditions we need, calculate the metrics, and then set the chart point. So this has quite a few arguments with it. The first one is just the name of the chart, right? So I'm just going to copy and paste this one in. So the name of the chart here, we're just calling it TSX Tech Stocks Revenue Growth versus Price to Sales Ratio. And we'll do a comma. The next argument is the series. And again, you have to put this, because it's a string, you have to put it in quotes. So within a scatter plot, you can have multiple series of data. So you could be mapping, what we're doing here, which is revenue growth versus price to sales. Maybe you also want to do, income versus a PE ratio. So you could have 2 different series of data within one scatter plot. We're just going to do one series of data, but you can call this whatever you want. So I'm just going to call it S1, which signifies series 1. But maybe you had multiple data. So for a different, line of code, you'd put S2 there. But again, we're just dealing with one series of data. And then the next thing you have to do is you define your X and Y data points, right? So the Y-axis is the one that is vertical, X-axis is horizontal. So this one doesn't really matter that much. I'm going to go with the PS, which again I defined here, so the price to sales ratio, which is going to be our X-axis, and then on the Y-axis is going to be the other one, which is the variable here, revenue CAGR. And then one more argument is what you want the title of the scatter plot points on your chart to be. So once the scatter plot is actually generated, if you hover over one of the scatter plot points, is it going to, what data is going to show? And we want it to show you like the company name because we want to be able to identify what company a scatter plot point is because that's really the whole purpose of why we're doing this, right? It's to try and identify outlier companies. So, which we've already defined, which is ticker, right? So whatever, we define ticker up here. So whatever the ticker is, it'll show us when we hover over that data point. So that's pretty much, the meat and potatoes of it. The next thing we have to do is we have to do end. So basically, wherever there's an if statement or where there's ever a for loop, you have to end it with the word end, and then you also have to end, the code overall. So this end here ends the code overall. This end here ends the if statement. This one here, we have another if statement here, so we have to do another end, and we have the for loop, which we have to end that as well. So 3 ends we have to write here. Now, before the last end, so there's a few things we have to do. We also have to add titles to the X and the Y axis. So I'll copy and paste these two in and then kind of explain what they mean. So before the last end, this is the last thing the code is going to do. So we use this function that we created called set generic prop by name, which prop, it means property. So we have the title here. Make sure the first argument, is the title. Make sure the title matches whatever title you wrote in here. The next one is what you actually want to define, which there's a few different options that we have here. It can be the X title, the Y title, or you can specify the chart type, whether you want to do a line chart or a bar chart. Those are other possibilities, but we're just focusing on scatter plots for this. So the X title, and we've already determined that the X-axis is going to be PS. So we'll title this PS ratio, right? This doesn't have to match. This doesn't have to match what we actually have set the variable to, but it just has to mean the same thing, right? So it's the price to sales ratio. The other one, the y-axis is going to be our 3-year revenue compound annual growth rate. And then the last thing we might want to add is maybe just a print statement that signifies to our user that the chart's been successfully generated and tells us where to go. So you go to Insight Charts, which is right here, and then there's 2 options, 2 tabs in Insight Charts now, one of which is generic plots. So that's how you see that. And then one last thing we have to do, again, is another housekeeping thing. We're going to do this right at the top underneath function. And we're going to do a chart here, which is called, we're going to delete the chart actually. So this is delete generic chart and then the name of it, which is the exact same name that we've been using throughout. So what this does is it ensures that if you have a chart by this name that already exists, so say you were testing it, you ran this chart, you came back to the script, made some adjustments to the code, now you want to run it again, it deletes the old one and then replaces it with a new one. So it determines if the old one exists. If it does, delete it. If not, then this basically does nothing. So we can save this now and we can try and give it a run and see what happens. So I'll click run here and it'll take us to the log. You can see it's initializing and it's going to take, a couple seconds to run because it's going through every single company on the list and determining if it meets those conditions. So it does require some compute power, but we can see it has finished here. So now it's basically telling us, go to Insight Charts and then go to generic plots. So we go Insight Charts, and then we have time charts here and then generic plots here. So we click generic plots. And then here we can see is our scatter plot, right? And we can zoom in as well and get closer to some of these data points. And we can see if we hover over, we can see, what some of these companies are. So, an outlier in this case would be, say this one here, which is DND.to. They've had 80% revenue growth for the past 3 years, but their price to sales ratio is only about 1.8, right? Versus all these companies here, which have had less revenue growth, but a higher price to sales ratio. So this is one example of what you can do with scatter plots, right? And then we can look at the whole data here. There's some outliers over here, which is companies with very high price to sales ratios. You can see MAGT. I think that's Magnet Forensics, which is a company I talked about once on this channel a while ago. There's DSG. That's another one. I haven't heard of that one. Shopify is here as well. But basically, these are all TSX tech stocks and, the data points. And kind of as expected, we've seen, the chart kind of goes like this, right? It goes up and to the right. But anyways, guys, that pretty much does it. That's how you generate scatter plots. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop a comment and let me know. I will publish this script here so that anyone who wants to, come on Tickernomics and go to public scripts, you can use this script, and then maybe you can just modify some of my code to create your own scatter plot for looking at different industries or different metrics. But yeah, that pretty much does it. So thanks for sticking around. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.